Welcome to another Big Jimny video. In this short video we're going to take a look at changing the oil pan, or the sump, or sump pan as some people call it, on a Jimny. Now this video is actually on an SJ which has got the G13A engine in it, but of course Jimnys have the G13B or the M13A, and these are all engines from the same family, and therefore whilst there may be some minor differences, what we tell you in this video does apply to both the Jimny with the G13B and the Jimny with the M13A. Now why would you want to change the oil pan in the first place? Well, the oil pan on Jimnys has a bit of a reputation for leaking oil. You can do this in two ways. One way is literally around the seal at the top of the pan. This is because it doesn't come with a gasket as standard from the factory. It just uses RTV or silicone gasket from the factory to seal the joint. And this doesn't necessarily last that long within the life of the car. The other problem that they do have is they do have a tendency to rust, and they rust in a slightly strange way because of course as the pan rusts through, then it starts to leak oil, and the oil prevents the rust from getting any worse, and therefore you get a pan that's continually covered in a film of oil, never really leaks a lot, but it's just got a generally oily appearance about it. Now I call this a porous oil pan, and this is quite common on the M13 engines in particular, that you get this sort of weeping leak in it that never really develops into anything more than an oily oil pan. Anyway, so this is about how to change the oil pan itself. Now I've got mine from Suzuki and I do sell them in the shop, so there's some links above to the shop where you'll find both the G13 and the M13 oil pans. They are different in terms of their shape, but they're in the shop there if you wish to purchase them. Before we get started, let's have a quick look at the oil pan on this SJ. This is James's red SJ. We've had it a couple of years now under restoration, and finally during the summer the oiliness of it began to get to him. So we took a look round, and in his case it does appear rusty. As you can see, there's rust across the front here, and then rust around the lower bit where the actual oil drain is. But in this case it did seem to actually be the gasket seal around the top of the pan that was really doing the leaking. There's a lot of oil around there, and if you leave it any time, a few drips appear on the ground underneath the car. You can also see around the oil filter a few little drips as well, which also suggests that the oil filter may be weeping from its gasket. But we'll be changing the oil filter as part of this because the very action of changing the pan means we'll be changing the oil, so we might as well do a full oil change on it whilst we're doing the work. So the first thing we need to do is to remove the sump plug. Now throughout this video you will see me using 6-point sockets. Okay, I think it's pretty essential to be using 6-point sockets on a job like this because you don't want to round off any of the bolts that you're trying to undo. And if your sump plug hasn't been undone for a long time, that one you really don't want to round off the edges. So by using a 6-point socket, you can apply as much leverage as you possibly can onto the head of the bolt without it typically turning off the edges of the bolt itself. So first of all, with using a suitable drain bin underneath, undo the sump plug and drain out the oil. The pan itself is held in place by a number of 10mm bolts all the way around the base of the pan, and if yours hasn't been leaking oil into any great extent, these could well be corroded into the bottom of the engine. Now you really don't want to shear these bolts off, so what I did was spray them round with penetrating oil for a couple of weeks before we did the work. So every few days go out and spray around. As you can see here, the ends of the bolts actually stick out into the air above the flange to which they're bolted. So you can spray all along the top here and it will penetrate down into the bolts. And it was a straightforward job actually to undo all of the bolts around the pan itself. At the back of the sump is the base of the gearbox itself, and there's a tin plate a thin protector plate, which if you haven't been off-roading will still be in place, although if you have been off-roading you may well find it's been pushed or bent away and is full of mud. Okay, but you still need to remove this in order to access the bolts at the rear of the sump pan. With all the bolts removed, then the pan will be able to be levered off. Now, ours almost came away straight away. As you can see here in these pictures, it has evidently been fixed before. This wasn't for us, this was a previous owner has used this bright orange RTV to stick the pan on, so I suspect that this car has had some oil leaking issues from the pan in the past, and someone has taken it off and tried to glue it down. If you look closely at the sealant, you can actually see beads of oil all through the sealant itself, so it's clearly leaking. And as I say, when we undid all the bolts, the pan virtually dropped straight off, so it was clearly not firmly stuck in place. You may find that with a pan that's got good RTV on it, that you'll need to use some leverage to get it off of the car. The way to get it off is to put it down and move it backwards. You don't need to take the engine out or anything clever like that for this. You can remove the pan by taking it backwards over the steering arms and out underneath the gearbox. When you've done this underneath, you can also get a good view of the crankshaft and underneath the piston, so have a look round. As you can see, it came away fairly cleanly, although there is a bit of sealant left in place on the base of the engine, which we will need to remove. Here is the oil pan, the new one. You'll notice that there is no gasket on it. In some countries they do sell gaskets as an aftermarket part, but Suzuki themselves just do a metal to metal sealing using gasket. So the idea here is, obviously this has got paint on it, and this paint has been applied to the sump. Now I don't trust the paint on these not to peel off or not be stuck on properly. So the first thing I do is remove the paint using one of these abrasive sanding pads. Just keep going at the paint until you get a nice clean metal finish. And then went underneath the car and did exactly the same to the base of the engine, where all of that residual RTV was still stuck to the bottom of the engine. A good clean round with one of these pads to clean up all of the old silicone, move it away. And then I also used a alcohol based cleaner to remove all the traces of oil from the bottom of the engine, so that both surfaces, the pan and the engine, were nice and clean. I then looked around for a suitable sealant to use, an RTV sealant. There were lots of suggestions that I got for it, but the most common one was for Permatex Grey or Permatex Black. I looked through the spec sheets for both, and Permatex Grey specifically says that it is suitable for oil pans. So that is the sealant that I've used on this. Now, I'm not that expert at squeezing sealant out of a silly little tube, so it's a bit messy. But you put a bead around all the way around the pan, so that both the edges of the pan are sealed and round the bolts has got sealant around it. But it's not pretty. It's then a matter of moving the pan up behind the steering arms up into position. You may have to wiggle it a bit to get the oil pickup, the oil pickup strainer into its place in the pan, and the front of the pan has got two studs to locate it, and then run a couple of bolts in to hold it in place. Try not to get the sealant all wiped off on the bottom of the gearbox and things like that as you slide it in. It's quite tricky to get it all in there. Now, the Permatex instructions say to do it up finger tight, so I went round with all of the bolts and just did them finger tight. Now this was actually cheated a little bit, because some of them were so sticky to put in you couldn't actually tighten them with fingers because of just grit and that in the threads. So what I did do was just wind them in with the ratchet, but without putting any force on it, just so that it got to the point where you saw it lift the pan just slightly, and was fairly easy to still undo. It wasn't that tight. You then let it dry for an hour. So with it loosely held in place, you let it dry for an hour, and then you tighten them off to the correct torque. So these are 10 Newton meters according to the manual. It says between like 9 and 12 Newton meters. So as my torque wrench only goes down to 10 Newton meters. I use 10, and then you tighten them up all the way around so that the seal is made. When you've done that, fit the oil filter if you're changing the oil as a whole, and then wait 24 hours for the sealant to cure, and then fill with oil. And the job is done. So, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. And until next time, drive carefully. I'll catch you further down the road.